Hello, I am your host, Tracy Otsuka. Thank you so much for joining me here for another episode of ADHD for Smartass Women. You know that my purpose is always to show you who you are and then inspire you to be it. And in the thousands of ADHD women that I've had the privilege of meeting, I have never met one, not one, that wasn't truly brilliant at something. So, of course, I am absolutely delighted to introduce you to Andrea Epting. Andrea is a psychotherapist and Savannah native who graduated from the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa with a double major in psychology and religious studies. She then went on to earn a master's degree in psychology with a specialty in professional counseling from Argosy University. In 2006, she began a career as a psychotherapist. She is also a licensed professional counselor, a master's addictions counselor, and certified sex therapist with 20 plus years of experience in trauma-initiated process addictions and betrayal trauma. As a neurodivergent professional with ADHD and OCD and mother to two neurodivergent young adults, Andrea brings personal insight to her work. She is the founder and CEO of Heads Up Guidance Services, also known as HUGS, a nonprofit providing accessible mental health care, and she runs her private practice, Resolve Strategies, Inc. Andrea also shares therapeutic resources through her podcast, Direct Impact, and authored the Plan to Recover journal. She is married, and she's been honored as a young rising star of Savannah. Welcome, Andrea. Phew, did I get all of that right?
Oh my gosh, yes, you got that all right.
That was a lot. But I felt like there was so much that you did that was relevant that I wanted to include it. And I didn't even talk about the fact that I think we have the same number of podcasts.
Just about. Like, we're kind of like neck and neck with the amount, anyway, of podcasts that have been released. Yes.
So what is your podcast called?
It's called the Direct Impact Podcast with Andrea Epting.
Ah, well, okay. The Direct Impact Podcast. And so when did you start it?
Oh my gosh. I remember it being around or on Halloween. I think it's been 3 years now. I'm looking over at Mary, who's my producer. 3 years.
Do you record twice a week?
No, I record once a week, but I batch episodes.
But how are you only at 300? I mean, how are you already at 300 in 3 years? I've been doing this since 2019.
Well, we have solo episodes, candid conversations, and mindful meditations.
So, no, you do not do it twice a week. You do it 3 times a week, which that
it
makes
releases,
perfect sense.
but I only record once a week.
Got it. Okay, I've got it. So clearly, we are going to talk about addiction and ADHD. But before we go there, I always want our audience to really get to know who you are as a person. So can we talk about your diagnosis first?
You absolutely can. And I just absolutely love that about what you offer your community. And so to my recollection, and I really had to resist the impulse to gather more information from my parents because I know that they're going to have a different perspective from what I remember. So what I remember is going into this old school building when I was in elementary school and having this massive battery of tests done. And then I also remember the results of that test being that there's no excuse for me to have the grades I have because I'm so smart. And so I do believe that there were diagnoses that came from that of ADHD and OCD, but that was not relayed to me till later.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. Much later?
Around middle school, it became more of a language that was being used.
So was this around puberty? Or was this before puberty?
No, this was elementary school. I started to struggle in 3rd grade. It's so common, right?
Yeah.
In 4th grade, it really became evident because I was doing so well. And I'm such a perfectionist and I'm so intuitive, right? Mm-hmm. So I get away with a lot. So yeah, in 4th grade, I just hit this roadblock and it was like, well, what's wrong with her? And a lot changed at that point. And I lost interest in a lot of things because I didn't feel like I was doing it well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. However, you you lost interest in school. I'm trying to understand because it sounds like you were diagnosed with ADHD, yet they still came back and said, oh, but you're also really smart. So there's no excuse to not be able to do what you should be doing that you can't do.
Absolutely. And we're talking about the early 80s. Or at this point, it's probably around 88, 89, between 87 to 89.
Yeah.
So we're still not, giving this diagnosis to females very often.
Right.
And so I think that's part of what we're experiencing at that point. The language started to change as I entered into high school and when I started taking medication, which was not until I was a junior in high school.
So were you hyperactive or were you more inattentive in your head a lot?
And thanks to your podcast, Tracy, I definitely believe that I am combined type and my hyperactivity is predominantly in my brain. So it's the ping, 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 ping of ideas and thoughts and the fear of forgetting half of the good ones, So a lot of hyperactivity in the brain. I believe in my childhood, it decreased in adolescence, but there was a physical hyperactivity as well. But I was a gymnast who was in the gym 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, competitive gymnast. So it was worked out of me.
Exactly. So that's probably what allowed you to do as much as you were actually able to do. But I'm curious, did you have bad grades?
I had excellent grades until fourth grade, and then they were mediocre at best.
Yeah.
If I was getting C's, usually I had B's and C's, and of course I'd have an A in something that I was interested in. So it was it's fine. I'm an athlete. That's where I excel. And so it's okay that I have mediocre grades.
Why were you actually sent for a diagnosis? What kind of behaviors were you exhibiting? Or was it purely the fact that, the adults around you could hear you speak. They're like, she's very intelligent. So why doesn't she have the grades to match it? Why did they send you in?
Yeah, I think that was a big part of it. And then I also just started to not perform academically, especially in math. When I hit second grade, I remember math all of a sudden being a problem. And, by the time I hit fourth grade, there were other things that were starting to show up. I did not receive a diagnosis for any learning disability, although I really disagree with that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And certainly probably in that era, it was even worse than it is today. So if they saw ADHD, they saw everything through ADHD, right?
Lens, yeah.
So then what happened? It sounds like you didn't really take it that seriously. You didn't really even know what it was until when?
I didn't. I didn't take it seriously until I was a senior in high school and wanted to go to college. When I received the feedback of, it's okay, baby, college isn't for everybody. I was like, the hell it isn't. And then I started studying straight A's my senior year. And of course, I had medication behind me at that point. We can talk more about that in a minute, because at that point in my life, I do believe it was helpful. And so, straight A's, applied to schools, got into many universities. And by the time I was in college, I was doing great academically.
You were probably studying something you were interested in.
Absolutely.
Too, right? So did you have any quote unquote behavior problems? Were you a challenge or were you a good girl?
I was talkative. No,
Okay,
I was impulsive and talkative. Absolutely.
Okay. It sounds like you started to take it seriously in high school, but did you still not really understand what ADHD was?
I definitely not to the degree I do now, but no, I didn't. And honestly, when I started taking medication and things shifted, I started to convince myself I wasn't. Especially in college, the way I performed and when my personality really solidified and came online and my hormones were finally done a little bit, I started to question my diagnosis.
And so then what happened?
Well, and I want to add to that the medication also stopped serving me and started hurting me.
Oh.
And
what were you taking? Was it stimulant meds?
I was taking stimulants, and it was Adderall, I believe, at the time.
And had you been taking it every day or just when you needed to do something that
I was told to
difficult?
take it every day, and I took it every day, at least a time release tab every day. And then if I had to study, I would take the, rapid release.
And this went on for how long?
through grad school.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Through
And then
grad
after
school.
grad school, you stopped?
I did. I stopped with my first pregnancy.
Okay. And then never went back?
I did go back for about 3 months and was like, yeah, no, this is counterproductive for me. And because I have OCD tendencies, not a formal diagnosis, but
Yeah.
tendencies, it would make me so hyper fixated and focused on the things that weren't tasks I was supposed to accomplish. It's like,
Yeah.
why do I keep ending up in my closet and organizing my sock drawer when I have like a big paper too? So yeah, it didn't help.
So I'm still trying to get Andrea. Was there a time when you really started to think about ADHD, take it super seriously, and you started to understand, oh my gosh, this is affecting my entire life? And when was that time, if there was? Like, what happened?
Yeah. It was in my 40s. And it was, of course, like we hear so often on your show, with the diagnosis of my children.
Ah, okay.
And so I have a 20-year-old, almost 20-year-old son who is on the autism spectrum, also OCD. And I have a daughter who is ADHD. And just learning about that and how to navigate it and what's coming up, I'm like, oh my gosh, this really helps me understand my brain, the way I operate, the way I navigate the world, the way I orient to time. Oh my gosh. Like, all of the things
Yeah.
started to align. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, I am 1000% ADHD. Yeah.
Something that you had thought for, it sounds like decades, they got it wrong.
Right. I did.
So once that happened, what changed? Like before that, had you always felt, oh my gosh, I'm so different than most everyone else?
Yes. I think I noticed I was different, but not in a negative way. I think I noticed that there were certain things that I did differently, but not that I was different. And like, I'm going to compare myself to other people. Sometimes I actually thought, like, why don't they get it?
Yeah.
I think with my personality type, that came up a lot.
Exactly. What's wrong with them, right?
Yes.
I'm
Yeah.
curious though, did you grow up with trauma, childhood trauma?
I have not been able to identify any type of trauma or PTSD in my childhood. I really come from a family of ADHD, and so a
Yeah.
lot of mine is what I would consider to be genetic.
Yeah.
And then I do believe I had educational trauma that started in fourth grade that I can remember that
Yeah.
really did impact the way
But
that I saw myself as smart or not smart or intelligent.
did your parents, or at least one parent, however, consistently support you and they saw where you were brilliant?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Because there is something about ADHD, and I can really share what you're saying in that I think it's because I can't identify childhood trauma either. And I had two parents who really supported me and loved me who I was, even though I'm sure I was annoying at times. I had this attitude too that, well, they're all wrong. Look at all these things I can do. And I actually could do well in school. Not always. It sounds like you struggled more than I did. But maybe you didn't struggle as much once you figured out, oh, this is how it all works. College was a breeze for you, it sounds
was,
like.
and
Yeah.
grad school.
So for me, that's kind of where I fell down. So this is so interesting because I do see that mindset, right? Where, no, there's nothing wrong with me. It's you guys.
Even in fourth grade, when I was experiencing this abuse, which I could identify as abusive, and I could relay that to my family who took me out
Yeah.
and did as much as they possibly could to make sure this person never taught again.
I hope
I
they
knew
didn't.
at the time that there was nothing wrong with me. It was about her and her
Yeah.
inability to teach me.
Oh.
Like, I did know that, which helps a lot
Absolutely.
to process it,
Well, you can imagine if you have parents that are behaving like that teacher, and then the teacher, like, that is so traumatic. How could it not be?
Well, it's reinforced and it becomes very ingrained because there's nothing inside of you that says, no, this is wrong. this is about them, not you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're a kid. You're a kid. Okay, so let's talk about ADHD and addiction. And thank you for sharing your story.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we know, and I'm just fascinated to dive into this with you. It's something that I'm so interested in for so many reasons. So we know that people with ADHD are, I think it's 5 to 10 times more likely to develop substance use disorder. Can you explain why ADHD brains might be more susceptible to developing dependencies, whether we're talking about chemical or behavioral?
My initial response to that is the dopamine deficiency that already exists in the brain. And so, if we are dopamine deficient and we find chemicals that give us this feel good dopamine, it's hard to not become reliant on it and eventually dependent on it to function. I mean, that's what addiction is. At first, it's therapeutic, and then it becomes, it gets a hold of you and takes control of you. So, I think it is the dopamine deficiency that is a setup.
Yeah. So you're talking about reward deficiency syndrome?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what does that do? So it affects our motivation, right? And it affects the satisfaction that we get from rewards. Like I always talk about, you have that one glass of wine and you're really looking forward to it. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be so great. I'm going to feel so relaxed and calm and good, right? Positive emotion. You have that one glass of wine and you're like, it didn't really hit it. Maybe the second one. And then the third one, and kind of that's how it starts. So is there anything more that we need to explain about that or talk about that?
Well, I would talk a little bit more about brain chemistry and the development of either dopamine deficiencies or chemical dependencies. And so we talk about trauma because trauma can rewire our brain. Right, to make us susceptible to addiction and to start to have a lot of ADHD behaviors. Our brain chemistry has shifted at that point. We talk about genetic predisposition. I mentioned that I believe I'm very genetically predisposed. Trauma throwed fuel on that fire, sure, but it was in me when I was born. And then you also have with chemical dependency, using to the point of dependence. So if you use something consistently and it becomes this new neuro pathway and this well-worn path, it's hard not to continue to run down that path. And so I believe that we are more susceptible to our brain reward system getting hijacked.
Okay. So can you share, like you talked about ADHD and trauma, can you share your perspective on trauma, both big and small, and how that impacts individuals with ADHD and predisposes them to these addictions?
Yeah. And so most people, especially the ones who have a hard time identifying it, because sometimes there is, some denial wrapping around it, right? I think most humans, whether it was in the home or outside of the home, have some trauma. And a lot of people really do have complex trauma, complex PTSD. And so I think the misconception is it has to be something big and catastrophic and some form of crisis or a prolonged crisis that, will rewire the brain and we start to have post-traumatic stress disorders and symptoms, right? But no, I mean, it is the programming when we're young and when we are dependent on other people to teach us about ourselves and to reinforce things in ourselves that most traumas are initiated. So we look at the initiation of the trauma, the wiring of the brain, and I do believe that trauma, whether it's environmental or not, it is a big part of our ADHD symptoms.
I don't think you said this, but just to reinforce the fact that the symptoms of ADHD mirror the symptoms of trauma.
That's right.
So if you have trauma, developmental trauma, and then ADHD on top of that, you have like twice the amount. Well, we don't know exactly twice, but you have so many more symptoms.
Yeah, yeah. And again, that's kind of where I go back to the trauma initiates a dopamine deficiency that can look like ADHD as well as
Yes.
trauma.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you're saying is sometimes people don't have ADHD, but it looks like ADHD because there's been so much trauma.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
it doesn't, like, what's traumatic to you may not be traumatic to me, right? So it's so individual.
Oh yeah, and resiliency, as you haven't named it, but you've already been mentioning it.
Hmm.
Like resiliency makes a massive difference, and the to the degree that we're impaired.
So why can some people go through so much trauma, big T trauma, and they're so resilient?
Post traumatic growth.
Yes,
Yeah.
post-traumatic growth.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
why is it that some people go in that direction and
Yeah.
other people struggle so much?
Yeah. I mean, I do believe it has to do with the negative core beliefs that are constantly being reinforced by the behaviors. And so, how many negative core beliefs about ourselves were instilled in our childhood that these symptoms now reinforce over and over and over? I think that's a big part of it. I also think that personality is part of it, the way that we cope with distress. And when we are loved and cared for and nurtured and had support systems growing up where we do know what it's like to be in our window of tolerance and to feel safe and to,
Hmm.
we can cope with much more. And not only can we cope with more, we can identify when it's becoming a problem and make new choices. So,
So when there's trauma and it develops into, I don't know if it develops into, but then from that you get, addiction use disorder. Is that simply that you're trying to manage, you're trying to regulate your emotions?
mhm.
And so I guess if you are, let's say, using alcohol, you don't have to feel like, explain how that all works.
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on. When you are acting out chemically, so using or misusing chemicals, or behaviorally, which is acting out certain behaviors that are giving you that mood altering state, or the dopamine and all of the chemicals that come when you mood alter, you are avoiding reality. You
Mm,
are medicating symptoms, even if it's just medicating the state that you are in, or medicating the way your nervous system is now wired. And so, yeah, you can see how that becomes addictive. And so, the way I define addiction is it's a pathological relationship to a mood altering behavior that has life damaging consequences. And so, it starts off with this reward relationship,
mm.
and then it moves into something that is problematic, that even though now it's not working for you, you can't stop doing it. And the consequences start to pile up.
And is that because you've built that neural pathway to such an extent that that is the only way you know how to regulate your nervous system, even though it's literally not doing that anymore?
Yes. It's not that it is the only way, because like if you've identified it's a problem and you're in this contemplative stage of change, so you're looking at these things, you might be able to recognize, well, gosh, I could just go for a walk. But because one pathway has become that default mode, right? We
Yeah,
talk about
yeah,
the default mode. You're off to the races before you can register, well, I had other choices. And
yeah.
and I said, like, we are susceptible to having that reward system hijacked, which means other choices don't weigh in
Well,
until there's abstinence, and then it's like, oh, now I have an option.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happens a lot of the times with ADHD, right? And just how we manage it or don't manage it, and just jump into that default mode that
Hmm.
we've been doing for decades, even
Right.
though we know it's not working for us.
Right. Right. Oh
Okay.
yeah, but by the time you notice it's not working for you, it
Yeah.
is your well-worn path, and the other
Yeah.
options are not well-worn. You have to pull out a freaking machete and start like cutting through that jungle, right? So that's hard. Yeah.
But it is doable, right?
Doable.
So,
Absolutely.
so tell us, Andrea,
Mhm.
how do you approach helping individuals with ADHD who have experienced trauma and are struggling with addiction? Is it your premise that if you have not experienced trauma, what are the chances of addiction?
Oh gosh. I've never met anybody, Tracy, that's not experienced trauma in my practice.
Wow.
Or, probably my life.
Mm.
Trauma does occur. That's how we get these negative core beliefs about ourselves and how we don't really know our authentic self yet, right? So I can't answer the question about someone who's never experienced trauma,
Mm-hmm.
but the way I approach someone who comes in who has identified an addiction is we have got to get you into abstinence and then recovery for a period of 12 to 18 months that allows us to see if there is any type of ADHD or mental health diagnosis that then needs to be addressed. And we can go into trauma work during that period.
So, do you believe that there has to be abstinence? What about just drinking less? And so, my thought is always about the positive emotion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can imagine if this is your primary way and pretty much, your default mode
Mm-hmm.
of trying to regulate your nervous system, let's say it's alcohol. Positive emotion is so important, right? We can't get anything done if we're not in positive emotion. And I could see that if someone is telling you you cannot drink again, you cannot drink anymore, that would just be so much negative emotion for them. So what about trying to get them to drink less, and then they feel more positive emotion, and then they drink less, and then am I making any sense?
You're making sense. And I think I can answer your question, which is to say that yes, abstinence is required. By the time you are seeing negative consequences as the result of this behavior, then we have got to move into abstinence. And the positive emotion comes in when you start to implement other positive, right, coping skills that also give you dopamine and don't have a negative consequence at the end of it. So you don't want to ask anybody to stop doing the one thing that allows them to cope with this crappy life, right? I mean, like, life is hard.
Yeah.
It is challenging. And I would not suggest taking away your only coping skill without putting in other coping skills first that they can start to default to. And so, yes, I think it is very important that they have other options, because you're not going to tell me to stop doing the only thing that works for me.
Right.
No,
Right.
absolutely not. And yes, when I first hear that, it's going to cause stress, and I'm going to want to go do more of that.
Right. Right.
Sure. So there is an approach. Motivational interviewing is the approach at first to help people see, like, you've got tons of choices. You've got tons of options. Let's look at what works best for you.
And so when you're working with someone, then are you saying that, yes, they can start by just drinking less?
No, I say let's start with putting in new healthy coping skills that you can start to utilize and practice so that as you start to decrease and then eventually abstain, you're still good at getting good positive emotion. You're still feeling good about yourself.
So we are actually saying the same thing.
Yes.
You're basically saying, I'm looking at you, ADHD brain, and we're going to figure out what will work for you.
Yes.
Andrea, I love that.
Yes.
Okay, so then let's talk about, which is how we kind of together got into this conversation. Andrea reached out and I wanted her take on, well, what do you think about AA? Because the studies show that it's like, 10 to 15% actually have a lifetime of success with AA. But I mean, that is 10 to 15%. So that's something. So what do you think about AA?
Yeah, I think that AA offers some really important recovery elements when people are at the appropriate stage of change, so that when they're in preparation and action, it's like they want to make these changes, but they know that isolation is an issue. It's like, community is a great opportunity to not be isolated anymore. So some of the elements that are created there, which is structure, accountability, and community, yeah, please. I mean, I think ADHD brain or addicted brain, like, we thrive, like it or not, on structure and accountability and consistency and community. So it does offer a lot. I think it's just part of the equation, though. So, like, you're not going to hear me say that's the only way to get sober. That's not by far the only way to get sober, but I think that it can offer things, especially to certain people and personalities at the right stage, a lot. So I pay attention to where are you? Who are you? Where are you?
I love this. So my thought is, okay, but we know that we tend to resist directives. We prefer autonomy. AA is not like that, right? It's got these faith healing roots. And I think it really speaks to the same thing that we struggle with ADHD. It is a character flaw. It is a moral failing instead of, no, you just have a different brain and probably trauma.
Oh, absolutely. It's really not a character defect
Yeah.
to seek something out to feel better.
Yeah. Common
That is
sense.
not a character defect. You're absolutely right. And I think it's important to combine things that we know work in tandem, which is, therapy, group, 12-step programs. There are so many different ways to find what you need based on who you are and what you're looking to get out of this life. Like people need to be met where they are and with someone who does understand their unique challenges in their brain.
So when you work with clients, do you do this one-on-one or do you actually find more success when they're in community?
I was just having this conversation, and my answer 100% of the time is both. They work best together. You can get a lot of success in either, but the most success when they are combined.
Okay.
I mean, and I have been doing this for over 20 years, and when I see the combination of group or a 12-step program, but process group or task group in tandem with one-on-one therapy, that's the sweet spot. That's where you see a lot of change.
That makes perfect sense. I think especially when there's anything where shame's involved, right? Just seeing other people who've struggled with exactly what you've struggled with.
Yeah. And just talking about the ADHD brain, it's like when you've got reaction sensitivity and all of this going on, it's so nice to be able to feel all of that come up in a group setting and then go to your one-on-one therapist and talk about what came up in group setting. It's great. And eventually they get to a place where it's like, I'm identifying that this is coming up for me right now. And then they let their group love on them, right? But that takes time.
How long does this process typically take?
The process of recovery, yeah, 24 months to 5 years.
Okay,
And
so
it
2 to
really
5
depends.
years.
It really depends on the brain that you're working with and their lived experiences. So, but as far as compulsivity goes,
Yeah.
24 months.
What do you mean by that?
Compulsivity is the compulsion to use without your wise mind clicking on, without being able to say, yeah, I could do that, but these are going to be the inevitable outcomes and it might not be a great idea. So it takes about 24 months to really be able to pause, change direction, and then utilize those new skills that you've put in place,
Yeah.
consistently.
And I've got to believe that this kind of therapy also helps them when they have ADHD because it's all the same, right? Instead of impulsively jumping in, pausing, and then figuring out, wait, does that actually serve my intention? And can I see myself out there in, 12 hours after I've done this thing that is not serving me? How am I going to feel? Because we struggle to do that, right? Put ourselves into the future.
Right. Right. Absolutely. And we have impulsivity concerns.
Yeah.
And so it is the same, reflex, if you will. And so really focusing on that recovery from these unwanted behaviors or chemicals, or there's a behavior, allows this part of your brain to come back online and you can pause and change direction. And it's excellent. You might not act before thinking. And I personally am that ready, fire, aim personality. So
Yeah.
I'm going to fire and then I'm going to readjust and fire,
Right.
aim and fire again. And so, yes, I think all these concepts are very helpful for an ADHD brain.
And that serves you too. Probably not if you're concerned about how much you're drinking,
Right.
no. But starting a business, making new friends, like there's so many things that actually is really positive,
Oh
right?
yeah. Oh
But
yeah.
then there are other things. So
And when you're in recovery, you get to utilize all these amazing things about your ADHD brain for ways that help, right? And serve you well.
Andrea, do you find that a very high percentage of your clients have ADHD?
Yes. Yes. And the more and more you understand about the brain and the ADHD brain, you see it more and more and more. And you do speak of it like, oh my gosh, this is a superpower. It's like you have this opportunity to see big picture and then get granular. Like other people don't process information that way. And so it's just identifying it and being like, well, how does this work for me in my life? Because it can and does. So, yeah.
So I have this belief that almost all pathology, certainly in women, because that's who I work with, is related to not knowing who you are and not being able to live to your potential. We are so mission driven. And when there may be another person who can just punch the clock and, go through and then right off into retirement, but we can't do that. It literally affects everything in our life. And I'm curious what you think about that, especially given, your work with addiction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, Tracy, and I am that person. I mean,
Yeah.
you're talking about me in the beginning. It's like, oh, yeah, mission and passion and meaning is what it's all about. And yes, that's positive emotion, right? And so I believe that everybody needs that, though, ADHD brain or not. Like we all need passion and purpose to drive us. Otherwise, what is the point?
Yeah.
And us in particular, the ADHD brain, like we need it to be a point. we need to have a why or we won't.
Yeah.
Other people will anyway, but we will not.
Yeah. We need a why or we won't, or well, why not?
Right, right.
The study, National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. I think we talked about this, where what they discovered in this study is that 3/4 of people with addictions recover, most without formal treatment. And some of them can even reduce their consumption of, I think it was on drinking, right? It wasn't drugs. They can literally reduce their consumption of, their drinking to manageable levels. They call it spontaneous remission. Do you know anything about that? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I have like a million questions that come up when I hear a study because I want to know who did the study. I want to know what the study was for and who funded it and all of those questions. And I do believe that once you have established not just long-term abstinence, but recovery, bringing back in a behavior or even a little bit of a chemical like alcohol is very possible because the relationship at that point has changed. Your relationship to the chemical and behavior is different. So I see that happen all of the time. And the way we look at it is in the early stages of recovery, it's like we put these things on your inner circle. We have an inner circle, which is non-negotiable behaviors, a middle circle that is like things we need to have boundaries with, and then the outer circle, which is like all those healthy things that you need to have in your life that make the inner circle unappealing or unnecessary, right? And so I say, this is going on your inner circle for the next 90 days or the next 18 months. And then we're going to look about, is it time to move it to the middle circle? So something you have boundaries with. And when you move it out, that's when you start to see, like, has my relationship to this changed? Can I have boundaries with this chemical or behavior, right? So it's not never, oh my gosh, I would never say never. But you don't want to say always or never because that's untrue. There's not truth in it.
I love that. So what you're saying is, if you're using, we're going to say alcohol to self-medicate, once you do the work and figure out why you needed to use alcohol to self-medicate, then you have a completely different relationship to alcohol.
That's right. And when I go back to the definition, It is a pathological relationship to a mood altering behavior that has life damaging consequences.
Yeah.
If the relationship is different, there are no consequences at the end of it.
I love the way you think through all of this. So I'm curious, what are some signs that ADHD, we'll say women because that's who we specifically talk to, might be developing an addiction, especially when it comes to behavioral addictions that are less obvious?
Right, right. And so for our audience, like the behavioral addictions are going to be like relationships or sex and love addiction, shopping, Netflix, gambling, which can also be stock market, things like that that we're looking at. Codependency is an addiction, and that's what I see most commonly. When they are continuing to participate in the behavior despite the negative emotion that comes up as a result, that's when you would want to pay attention.
In eighth grade speak, if I start, I'm going to use alcohol again, I am drinking, and when everybody goes home, I do not feel positive emotion. I feel shame. I feel negative emotion. That is a sign that this is becoming a problem or is a problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, for whatever reason, I started menopause at 29. So I've been doing this menopause thing a long time. Okay.
Yeah.
And so another just negative consequence would be, I used to be able to drink alcohol, but now it makes me sick, or
Yes.
I get hangxiety.
Hangxiety? What
So it's like
is that?
it's the anxiety of the hangover. So it's like you wake up in the middle of the night with the hangover and you're like, what did I do? Why did I do that? The hangxiety that comes up when hormonally you start shifting again because alcohol messes with your hormones.
Yeah.
And so it's like, that's a negative consequence. And then if next weekend you drink again, we do have to look at that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I could understand, and especially society's messaging around alcohol, and especially as it's directed to women. Instead of dealing with the underlying problem, oh, well, let's just go have a glass of wine, right? It's gotten better, but I think it's still bad. It's still poor.
As somebody who's stepped away from alcohol for 3 years, and now I do drink on occasion. Like I went to Europe with my daughter, and we had some wine with some of our meals, and the relationship to alcohol has completely changed, because when I started not metabolizing it very well, I had to be like, okay, like I don't need to do this anymore. And so like I was one of those statistics that was able to change, the interaction and the relationship.
No, but I really like that, because what I see just with my own eyes is, women around me who were just fine with alcohol before, but now they're not. And it's getting worse and worse. And I think it is hormones. It is that. And I know for myself personally, I was a cocktail girl. And so you've got the sugar and the alcohol, and I can't really deal with either one of them anymore. And so I've had to switch. Well, I'd have had to go way back down. I only drink socially. I don't drink at home, or I don't really like the taste of alcohol. But I've noticed that, but you can have a glass of champagne and there's no residual. So I've had to like switch from what I was doing before. Like I can't do hard liquor at all.
No, and people don't understand that like alcohol metabolizes into sugar too.
Yeah.
So sugar on top of sugar, like that's going to make you pretty sick. And I know what I was going to say now is that now when I do go into restaurants, they have mocktail options. They have alcohol.
And they're good.
Wine. They have alcohol-free wine.
Wait, is that good? I've never tried that.
It's not bad. But as somebody who really did enjoy the taste of, it's not good enough to order. I'd rather have, Perrier with a lime, frankly. But my point is, you said things are changing, and they are. There are options. Like you can go out and have a great time with the girls, and alcohol doesn't need to be a thought.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't have to feel, because part of it too is, this whole social expectations around alcohol. If I'm drinking, you need to be drinking. And if you're not drinking, it makes me feel uncomfortable, like I can't drink,
That's
it's
right.
it's ridiculous. But again, I always subscribe to no, the only person you need to disappoint is everybody else so you don't disappoint yourself, right?
1000%. And I always say that if they need you to drink, that's about them, not about you. It has
Yeah,
nothing to do with whether you're engaging with alcohol or not. It's how they feel about their relationship to alcohol that's coming up.
absolutely. So I love this conversation, Andrea. I want to know from you, what do you think the key to living successfully with ADHD is?
Great question. I can tell you what's worked for me. And I don't know that it's a magical key to anything, but what has worked with me is absolutely no media at all. I have taken media out of my life, and I started in 2018, so it was before the pandemic. So no social media, no real media. I have a justice sensitivity issue, as
Yes,
many do, and I needed to completely disengage, and I have reaped the benefits of that.
I bet now.
Exactly. And the other thing that I can say is my calendar. The way that I engage my calendar, I have a real fear of forgetting things
Hmm.
because, I have so many brilliant ideas and it's hard
Yeah,
to capture them.
yeah.
So that's why I named one of our businesses lightning in a bottle. It's hard to capture, right? That thought and use it. So the way I engage with my calendar is very different now and very respectful to my brain. So I would say my calendar, detaching completely from media and also detaching from email and real mail.
Wait,
I
how do you detach from email?
completely let it go in 2021. I completely turned that over to an assistant.
Is it possible to turn email over?
It is. It is
Okay. I'm
possible. I
trying
will
right
coach
now.
you, Tracy. I will coach you on this. It is life changing to let go of email, and the physical mail I turned over to my husband because there is something about mail with
Yeah.
my brain that I do not need to engage with it. It dysregulates me.
Yeah.
And so I stopped doing it.
Okay, we're going to have to talk about that because I'm trying to work with a VA right now to take over I'm too big of a control freak. I don't even know if it's possible. And
No,
that's a
I
me
am too,
problem.
Tracy. I am. And it's very liberating when you delegate that.
Okay. Okay. We're going to talk about that. So before you go, Andrea, I want you to tell us what you're working on. If people want to know more about you, where do they go?
Yeah.
Pitch.
Okay, great. So, I'm in so much, but what I am working on is really promoting our Plan to Recover mini journal, a journal for recovery and self discovery. And you can find that on Amazon. And it is a way to automate new healthy habits and behaviors. And we really walk people through the process of identifying three for the next 30 days and implementing an AM and PM routine to give them the structure to automate those behaviors. And then there are prompts that you can engage or not on a daily basis that allow you to really better know and understand yourself and give yourself grace and all of those amazing things that we need. So the Plan to Recover journal is something I'm very passionate about, and so obviously people can also hear about that. Check us out on the Direct Impact podcast, Direct Impact with Andrea Epting. This season we are focusing on intimacy betrayal. It's a good listen. The episodes are about 20 minutes, so they're short. That's about, all I can do. So that's all I expect my audience to do. So I hope that people will engage with us that way. And the website is www.lightninginabottle.biz. And so any questions, I'd love to engage with your audience.
That sounds fantastic. Andrea, do me a favor. Send me your website. Send me the link to the Amazon planner, the planner on Amazon, so that I make sure that we have it in the show notes.
Absolutely. Yeah, you'll get all that.
Andrea, thank you so much for spending time with us here today. I love this conversation.
Oh, I loved being with you, Tracy. This was so much fun. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So if you like this episode with Andrea, please let us know by leaving a review. Our goal is to change the conversation around ADHD, helping as many women as we possibly can learn how their ADHD brains work so that they too may discover their amazing strengths. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you here next week.